Prequels are a funny thing. They're kind of a double-edged sword. On one side, you get to cash in on the appreciation for an established movie, but on the other side of the sword, it's difficult to think of many prequels that were all that good. The most obvious, of course, is Star Wars, but there's also The Hobbit, Fantastic Beasts, Oz the Great and Powerful, 300 Rise of an Empire, X-Men Origins, or Cruella to name a few. And even when the movie is good, the consensus usually ends up being that, yeah, it's good and worth seeing, but unnecessary and not quite as good as the original, like with Monsters U, The Godfather Part 2, Temple of Doom, or X-Men First Class. The best example I can give of one that ended up being the best in its series is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Well, I think Furiosa probably falls into that second category of pretty good but unnecessary and ultimately paling in comparison to its predecessor. The movie begins with a young Furiosa looking to get an apple out of a tree in the green place. Some men from far away show up in their land, and Furiosa sneaks down to disable their bikes so they can't leave and inform wherever they came from of this secluded paradise. But the men see her and kidnap her to bring her back to Dementus's gang. Her mom follows to try and save her, and between her and Furiosa, all the men who kidnapped Furiosa are killed by the time she stands before Dementus, played by Chris Hemsworth.
The worst thing about prison was the Dementors.
Dementus wants to know where she came from and how to get there, since all the men who would know are now dead, and Furiosa remains his only source of information. Furiosa's mom infiltrates the camp and attempts to bring Furiosa home. She's caught, however, and Furiosa watches as she's brutally tortured and killed while refusing to give up the location of the green place. And that is where the character of Furiosa's story begins. The rest of the film sees Furiosa growing up under Dementus's care and learning the brutal ways of the wasteland, how she comes to be in the Citadel and transformed into the warrior we see in Fury Road, and her attempts to return home to the green place. Alongside her journey is Dementus's own journey as he tries to gain more and more power from Immortan Joe. It'll always make me laugh that his name is Joe. So, how'd the movie do? Well, as a standalone movie, or if it had come out before Fury Road, it's very good. Give it an 8 out of 10. But as a prequel to Fury Road, it's an unworthy successor. Or, I guess, predecessor, if you will. On its own, there aren't many real problems in the writing to speak of. There are some head-scratcher moments where characters don't seem to act consistently. Like, why do Dementus and his gang seem to stop trying to get the information of where Furiosa's from out of her? They just kind of start treating her really well because Dementus likes her for some reason. Furiosa shaves her head and pretends to be a boy to escape the captivity of being prepped to be a wife, but when she's grown up and her hair grows back out, somehow nobody bats an eye about this woman driving the war rig, despite the fact that there are no female warriors of any kind besides her. And of course, there is a moment where she survives an RPG almost directly to the face. But other than those, there aren't too many flaws to speak of. When you view this movie with the knowledge that it's a Mad Max film, specifically a prequel to Fury Road, however, you start to see the film's struggles. That's not to say it isn't still good. The action scenes, while not as good as Fury Road's, are nothing to scoff at and are still wildly entertaining, even if they're fewer and farther between. The world building is great. Better than Fury Road's for sure, but there are problems, like with the pacing. It's long, half an hour longer than Fury Road, and to be honest, it just doesn't justify those 30 minutes. There's a solid portion in the second and third of the 5 parts that really drags on, and after a long day of work, I was honestly tempted to close my eyes and take a little nap, which should never happen in a Mad Max film of all movies. But the real problem with the movie, the primary reason that when viewing it as what it is in relation to Fury Road, it just doesn't cut the mustard, is in its titular character. In this movie, Immortan Joe has quite a small role. Tom Hardy's character is never mentioned. They don't spend a whole lot of time building up the role of the women that Furiosa takes with her in her escape attempt. This movie is all about Furiosa. Really, this is less a prequel to Tom Hardy and Charlize Theron's epic and more an origin story for the character Furiosa. And in that regard, the movie falls short, because the biggest thing it lacks isn't world building, it isn't an engaging and mostly logically consistent plot, it's character development. When Jason Bourne came out in 2016, there was a joke that Matt Damon got paid $1 million for each line he speaks in the movie. And it's not really a joke. He got paid $25 million for 25 lines. But with that movie, it was the 4th movie we had with Jason Bourne. We already knew the character quite well, and Matt Damon gave a solid performance in his non-verbal acting. Well, Anya Taylor-Joy in this movie might have said fewer lines than Matt Damon. Now, that's not necessarily the worst thing. Again, Matt Damon pulled it off fairly well in Jason Bourne. But Furiosa falls into a trap that so many modern movies do. It writes Furiosa with perhaps her number one trait that comes to mind as stoic. Now, in the near future, I'm planning to make a video exploring this concept more of how modern writers seem to think the best way to portray a female character as strong is to write her with as few emotions as possible, and how it leads to uncompelling, forgettable characters. But here's a little sneak peek. And I'll use this as an opportunity to shamelessly plug the channel and encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss that video when it comes out. Not all stoic characters are poorly written. Some of the most beloved characters ever are pretty stoic. But the great part of watching a movie or TV show or video game focused around a stoic character is watching their stoicism break. Whether they start to get overwhelmed and their cool confidence is shaken, or another character breaks through a defensive wall they've put up.
He's trying to.
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay.
Oh.
What isn't fun is watching a character start out as stoic, remain stoic, and finish the story as stoic as they were at the start, without breaking at any point in the movie. That's what we call a static character. Well, in this movie, Furiosa is a static character. She remains stoic throughout. Now, in Fury Road, she's also stoic, but that movie's different. In that movie, she's focused. Her energy and her thoughts are directed toward her mission of escaping back to the Green Place. But towards the end of the movie, when, spoiler alert, she finds that the Green Place is now uninhabitable, it breaks her. We see her stoicism break. That doesn't happen in this movie. What the movie should have done is characterized her initially as a normal young girl who would be terrified by the situations she's finding herself in and emotional, as young people, particularly girls, are, and let us see how she transformed into the Furiosa we get from Charlize Theron in Fury Road. But nope, Furiosa was always that Furiosa since she was 8 years old. A couple last miscellaneous comments. The soundtrack is lackluster. That's a completely subjective point because I don't know enough about music to explain to you with evidence why it wasn't great, but it didn't stick with me. And finally, Chris Hemsworth is having a great time in this movie. I mentioned in my last video reviewing the movie If that there's something to be said for watching a movie where you know the actors were excited to be making it. And it makes Chris Hemsworth Dementis the most fun character in a movie that is really kind of lacking fun. But you also might forget that he's in the movie, or wonder if they're done with him when he disappears for an hour in the middle of it, because this is really just Furiosa's story. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, is weighed down by the expectations that come with following Mad Max Fury Road. But those were by no means insurmountable. It's not like it was following The Dark Knight with legendary performances on top of a thrilling, basically airtight story. It didn't need to do anything super crazy, but it didn't do much of anything at all. And as a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road, which I don't think any of us felt really needed one, Furiosa doesn't successfully justify its need to exist in the Mad Max franchise.
All right, the sauce.
What?
The sauce. I don't know. You're using too much sauce. Okay? Review's over.